just to get started, I want to make a quick comment on the decoupling of wages and productivity graph that Sandy showed. Yes, it's true that its validity can be questioned, but when you look at the implication of the decoupling, it is that the share of wages in national income will decline if productivity grows faster than nominal wages for a long time. And this is exactly what the research shows that has been going on in advanced economies since the 70s and 80s. Can you hear me? Okay. And the other implication of this development is that if consumption demand, especially if it is to keep up with GDP growth, then private debt must be accumulated on the part of households in order to fund the gap between productivity and wages. And as we saw prior to the 2008 crisis, this tends to create not only inequality but also instability in the macroeconomy. This is basically a fueling process of the housing bubble, for instance, was based on this. But let me see if I can. Yeah, well, my angle was to approach neoliberalism not only from this general point of view, but to look at some of the specifics. How the zeitgeist of neoliberalism, how does it percolate into policy? And in my research, I have resorted to this theory of policy ideas, which one good definition, I think, is that they are influential problem definitions that steer policymakers to certain solutions. And in Finland, in recent times, I think two kinds of these very influential policy ideas have been very much framing welfare state reform policies. And they are the sustainability gap, kestävyysvaje, in public finances, and then a bit more recently this idea that Finnish economic hardship was due to lost export competitiveness. I think these two frames have, well, they are both explicitly included in the government's agenda. Both trends, as it were, need to be reversed. And both of these ideas also have common traits in the sense that they derive from economic theories actually quite directly. And in so doing, they also contain a lot of assumptions and assumptions and uncertainties that are not usually explicitly referred to when these ideas enter policy arena. The uncertainties involved are usually just skated over. And when you start to analyze the backgrounds and motivations and justifications that are involved in formulating these both of these policy ideas, I think they both point to the conclusion that labor's bargaining power needs to be weakened quite significantly, actually, if the welfare state is to be maintained in Finland. And in this sense, I think one answer to the discussion about what is neoliberalism, in my view, it's one can approach it from the angle that well, I had it written somewhere actually, but I'm a bit nervous here. Sorry. Yeah. Especially in the Nordics, I think the important thing is that it signals a shift from state policies that were geared towards maintaining full employment, a commitment to full employment and equitable growth. And I think these premises have been abandoned since the at least since the 1990s. I think this is the turn point in the Nordics, that full employment is, it gradually starts to erode from the policy agenda. Yeah, so as you know, Finland faced, after the euro crisis and the financial crisis, Finland was prolongedly in a bad state economically in 2009 and 15. And there emerged this discourse that this is due to the fact that Finnish companies were outpriced in the world markets. And the reason behind this is that wages grew disproportionately in Finland during those years. And a catchphrase was that Finnish competitiveness is 10 to 15% behind from the usual, well, to which is from Germany and Sweden. And there was this specific indicator, unit labor costs, that calculated by many economists. But this 10-15% figure came from the Bank of Finland in 2015. And again, this figure and a goal of reducing this gap it's explicitly referenced in the government's platform. The trouble with this figure is that the way the unit labor cost indexes are construed, they don't allow us to say anything about the levels of costs. They only track the changes. So even if it's true that 10-15% losses were recorded during those years, it doesn't say anything about the absolute levels, which research again suggests that Finland is tied with Sweden and ahead of Germany. So clearly this isn't as robust as it is supposed to be. Even so, the government's policy has been to start reducing unit labor costs, and the metric basically is the relationship between ratio of wages to production. And the way to engineer this competitiveness improvement is basically to you either boost productivity or you freeze wages, which is what has happened in Finland during 15-16. And has it worked? Well, maybe. One can definitely show from statistics that Finnish unit labor costs have declined relative to the competitors, and also that our export sector is doing quite handsomely. I think it was on the news just yesterday that the exports have grown 18% from August. So we are doing really well. But is it really that the cost issues are boosting it? Or was the export trouble, was it about sluggish world demand growth from the get-go? I mean, how is it that quite a marginal drop in the wage component of costs, has it triggered an export boom? I myself find it quite hard to believe it, but this is the way the issue is framed, and I'm expecting that the wage freeze policy will continue. Okay, there will be bargaining negotiations are going on at the moment, and nominal increases are about to be agreed on. But anyhow, I think the permanent result of these occurrences is that good, well-paying jobs in Finland, I don't think they are as much on the agenda as many people probably would like. I guess I'm running out of time, but this is the other issue that's been framing Finnish policies lately, which is the idea that we cannot afford the welfare state because our population is aging. And this will cause, according to the dominant problem definition, a permanent negative shift in the government budget. And as the issue is portrayed in public discussion, it is usually framed as though it's just about aging. But when you start to look how the sustainability gap is constructed in the literature, it emerges as a quite intricate theoretical construct, and just as important as the demographic issue is the assumptions that, for instance, the finance ministry have about economic growth in the future. And well, many people around will know much better than myself about the issues that are well contained in the calculations because of uncertainties related to how exactly will age-related expenses grow. I think this was this uncertainty was brought about by the Valtiontalouden tarkastusvirasto earlier this year. Yeah, finance inspection of Finland. But yeah, well, I guess I'll skip over the part about what these calculations actually measure. I don't want to delve on that. You can read the part in italics, like the theoretical framework and the question that is being posed. But usually the combination of structural reforms, which might refer to, for instance, pension reforms, or also to labor market reforms, in my view, they are lumped together. Expenditure cuts and policies of growth are proposed and pursued to get rid of this sustainability gap. And it's when you look at the what exactly counts as growth in this context. For instance, the Finnish economy is growing quite well at the moment, and the finance ministry was quick to comment in late August that this doesn't really resolve the issue, even if the growth goes on. And this is because they expect us to hit the limit of potential growth, that is growth that can be attained without runaway inflation. So in order to solve the issue, it's not only need to cut expenses, but also to raise the limit of potential growth in Finland. And as the theories behind the sustainability gap literature shows, this is done by reducing real wage demand. This is the way to go. This gives the economy to the scope for growing without triggering a situation where we are too close to full employment. If we are to believe the finance ministry's latest assessment of the situation, this growth potential is it will be exhausted at the turn of the year, regardless of the headline unemployment rate. So, to conclude, these policy ideas that frame welfare reforms in Finland, they both point to the same conclusion, that if we are to have welfare states in the future, then it is labor that needs to be malleable and that must bear the brunt of the adjustment processes. And well, the question, I guess, is that is this an equitable solution? And what is the scope for perhaps different kind of policies if we accept the fact that these are, the frame is quite strong at the moment, as I think it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Now we have some questions posed by Joel, and I think there are several people here pondering on many questions directly to Sandy, but also, of course, to Joel. So we have to do in a way that you grab the microphone, and please, Mia, could you help us so that we all can hear? And I think it's Per. If you can introduce yourself when...
My name is Per Holt Christensen, a former economist, but now in the sociology of work and organization. But because I have this previous background, I have been, because the whole argument about austerity, social reforms, etc., has followed the automatism in Denmark as in Finland. It looks very similar, but when you go down and you critically debunk the data that has been constructed to help you argue in favor of this, in Denmark it shows that it is a cruel, it's a cruel use of economics. For instance, every year during the crisis from 2007 to 2011, the predictions would be that we would have a deficit on current account more than the 3%. And after every year in these 5 years, it turned out that we never came close to that limit. We had a growth from 25% to 49% in gross debt, public gross debt, where there is a 60% limit according to the European rules. But if you debunk them, it showed out that the accumulated deficit on current accounts, the state's current accounts, was 60%, out of which 60 billion Danish kroner, 40 billion Danish kroner of this was given as unfinanced tax reductions, right? So in a way, you have a system, and the rest was the state borrowing money to relent them to projects in Denmark. So it looked as if our foreign debt was increasing, but we invested it in firms associated with the state, which could then grow, because the state could get loans and earn 0.25% in negative interest and relent it to others. So in a way, in the figures of the whole system of the European Union system, we looked like we were failures. And they used that as an argument for austerity. But actually what we were expanding the use of the international financial system in a way which was intelligent if it has not hit the poor and those unemployed. So in a way, in a strange system, it was an awkward form of neoliberalism where you were playing the game and using economics in order to fool. And I think the politicians were fooled as well as the population. The strange thing is that economists which has access to all these data were not rereading these data in a way where they could see how we fooled each other in austerity. Today we have a trade surplus at the same percent per GNP per capita as in Germany. They are talking about the sustainability gap in a different way. They're saying, oh, there is both space for more welfare and for a lot of tax reductions, right? And the tax reductions will create the problems that will create a sustainability gap. So in a way, you construct in a vicious circle, like you have argued, the arguments, you prepare the arguments for continuing that road. Sorry for speaking to...
Thank you, Per. That was a comment from Denmark, and now we go to Iceland and give the word to Alo.
Thank you. My name is Eiklo Haraldóttir, and I'll be a little bit later on, but then of course I'm a former politician, so of course I have to talk a little bit more. When I was listening to Professor Schram, what I was waiting for through the whole really interesting speech was recommendations, because what should we be doing if we are if you're recommending that we stop looking at the individuals and we should rather look at the circumstances of people, what should the politicians then been doing in practice? It's been so often that I read interesting articles, I listen to interesting lectures like yours, but I keep waiting for the punchline, what to do in real life, not just, in a nice lecture room like here.
Thank you. You want to answer there?
Yeah, well, it's a great question and a great comment, and maybe we should let other people talk. It's not my strong suit, right? I've for years been largely a critic, but I think what's happened in recent years is a lot of people on the left are disappointed. I have a lot of criticisms, but then my solutions are to work within the existing system. I think for instance, I don't think that things like a basic income guarantee are a sellout type of proposition that makes us complicit in perpetuating neoliberalism. It's all a question of not so much what we do, but how we do it. And so if we are cognizant of the fact that the existing neoliberal system is concentrating power and wealth at the top, and they're using this, as Pierre was saying, in a vicious cycle to perpetuate inequality at their advantage, that's where our attention should be, to stop that from happening. So once we appreciate that government has been actively involved and is not a passive bystander in creating this vicious cycle through tax cuts in particular and anti-labor policies and so on and so forth, that want to resist that and try to break that vicious cycle so that ordinary people get to have more say about the kinds of policies that we're proposing. So a good example is like Obamacare. So a lot of people were very critical of Obama because they felt it was not single payer, it wasn't radical enough, it didn't stand up for the welfare state, it was complicit with the drug companies and insurance companies allowing the privatized system to go forward. On the other hand, I think the original proposal in Obamacare had a public option. And the public option was that if people weren't happy with the insurance they had, they could always go and take the public option. And they would the public option would be a competitor that would set a standard that other private companies would have to follow. A lot of people predicted that if the public option were enacted, it would force a lot of the less reputable insurance companies out of business, and they would just get out of it. And I think that was the main reason the public option was removed. And that was unfortunate. So that kind of small incremental reform in the existing hybrid public-private mixed system of health insurance in the United States could have been an instance of radical incrementalism. And I think Obamacare still has the ability to do that. It's reform within the existing system. And it actually expands private markets, but that doesn't mean just because it's neoliberal or it's reformist or it's incremental that it's necessarily bad. It could be, if it's done right, laying the groundwork for more progressive change. And I think, so in that sense, maybe I'm not a leftist anymore. I'm very critical of the existing system, but I also feel that we need to appreciate its reality, its hegemony, its power, and to figure out how it is that we can make change within it, enable us eventually to get beyond it. And that's why, in spite of it being less than perfect, I've been a strong proponent of Obamacare and trying to protect it from being repealed, because I think it has the potential to, over time, become more progressive. And I think across the policy spectrum, we could look at things like that. For instance, I don't think charter schools and voucher systems are going to go away now. People want those choices, especially low-income people. So the question becomes not whether we're for or against charter schools, but which ones and how, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we're more savvy about what it takes to get progressive change in an age of consolidated power, in manufactured austerity, and so on, I think we can do a lot more.
Thank you. Some more questions? Sakari, please.
Yeah, in my own presentation, I will have to come to these alternatives. But what I'd like to point out or kind of emphasize is that when Joel is talking about sustainability gap, etc., he talks about kind of like policy ideas. And when we are talking about neoliberalism as a policy, from my point of view, it's a question of policy and politics rather than economics. And we should be quite careful not to somehow label economics as such, even though, of course, economics has been utilized or badly utilized in some of these policy ideas. My point is that in comparison to liberalism, neoliberalism is a policy which is working on self-fulfilling prophecy. It's kind of like, it has this idea that in order to be able to promote stability, or in order to be able to produce some kind of market equilibrium, it just doesn't happen automatically. What we can succeed if we make people believe into our kind of like policies and ideas. And so, I mean, like if you read like Mirovsky's book on the road from Montpellier, it has been a policy for decades that have been brought up and articulated, and so now it's a question. My question kind of is that it can be that neoliberalism won't be that successful after all in the Nordic countries. It's a question of making politics, and it's a question of struggling with this. We can also make our own self-fulfilling prophecies or our policy ideas and struggle between these. And I think Nordic countries is an example of such struggles where there are not very clear wins, loses, wins and losses. And one could say also that take up the question that if we take this the statistics Sandy was showing, there is this Nobel laureate Robert Vogel who has said that there was this the fourth great awakening what happened in the United States around the 1970s, etc. Well, it's not that we should be waiting for the fifth great awakening, because there's a lot we can do. But from my point of view is that when we talk about neoliberalism, we would be very careful not to just kind of like identify it with some generation of Chicago economists or some this or that economist. It is rather a policy. It is much more a question of this kind of politics, making politics with kind of idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. I just take a little anecdote. When Robert C. Merton, who got a Nobel laureate, who is this economist who was modeling these financial markets and who could be kind of labeled as the guy behind these financial operations that have been taking place during the last 15, 20 years. His father was Robert K. Merton, who was the famous sociologist. And when he was asked, kind of, what did you learn, father? He said, well, one thing I learned was that he was always emphasizing the importance of these self-fulfilling prophecies. And then he said, when I have been criticized for giving these modelings and this kind of like exposition which I have made, the critics are wrong in believing that I think that this would be a factual statement. It's not a factual statement. It is just that when people would believe in our modelings and would put it in practice, then it works. So the question is that how to make these kind of like ideas folklore or common sense, and it always happens in these conditions where we make our history. And so I think that the tricky point is that this neoliberalism has been very successful because it is relational in its approach, even though it's talking about in terms of individuals. But I'm not that pessimistic. It can be that tides are changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakari. And then we have a comment here from Anne. It has nothing to do with this comment. No, feel free to present your
Anita
own ideas.
Nyberg. I'm from Gender Studies, Stockholm University, an economist. And I have been, and you mentioned that poverty has been studied in an individualistic sense. My problem as in gender and economics is that it has not been studied enough from an individualistic point of view. Because the data, at least my experience, is the data is based on households. The Gini coefficient, the relative, it's always on households, hardly ever on individuals. And I think some of the conclusions or the description you have of poverty would be very different if you had it on an individual basis and from a gender perspective. Because women's poverty has decreased, men's maybe have increased. And the income gap between men has increased, but it has not when it comes to women. So I think we need more data on an individual basis, not less.
Thank you, Anita.
Sorry.
You want to?
Well, that's a great comment, and I think it does add to the discussion quite constructively. So let's take gender, though. So gender is, like I said, some people that are involved in this movement of promoting a relational perspective, that's one of their examples, is that gender is not really a term that should be used to identify individuals. Gender is more about a relationship. So it shifts the focus from identifying people by their gender, say, to what is the nature of gender relationships and how do they structure who gets to be poor or not and have opportunity or not. And so, yes, I think we need more better data about individuals as well as households and so on and so forth by gender, race, class, so on and so forth. But I would add that when we get those data, we need to interpret them in terms of a relational perspective. Like I was trying to do with the welfare state, that the welfare state is very much at risk because of class relations and how it's been implicated in intensifying inequality and how that structures what kinds of policy opportunities we do or do not have going forward. And so I think this idea of bringing back in relations and relationships and not seeing individuals in isolation is a way of politicizing the topic that creates opportunities for progressive change.
Thank you, Sandy.